In 2012, we dug rooms in the tunnel for Diddy. It began as one of those strange, secretive projects that no one questioned aloud. The orders came from someone higher up, a faceless figure of authority, and those of us tasked with carrying out the work simply nodded and set about our business. The tunnel already existed, a relic of a bygone era when cities built vast networks underground, hiding them from the public's gaze. But what we did there that year turned a forgotten tunnel into something much darker. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. I remember the first time I descended into that place, the cold air clinging to my skin like a second layer. The tunnel stretched endlessly in both directions, its walls damp and whispering with the sound of unseen water dripping. The flickering lights installed decades ago barely worked, leaving most of the space in shadow. Yet it wasn't the darkness that unnerved me, it was the silence. Above ground, even in the dead of night, there's always some sound. A car passing, leaves rustling, the hum of a distant street lamp. Down there, though, it felt as if the world had been muted. The project was simple in theory. We were to carve out rooms within the tunnel walls, small, cramped spaces just large enough for someone to stand or lie down in. The specifications were precise: 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, 4 feet high. They weren't to have any amenities, not even lighting. When I asked what the rooms were for, my supervisor, a man named Ellis, gave me a sharp look and told me to keep my questions to myself. "You're here to dig," he said, "not to think." Still, I couldn't help but wonder. The other workers and I speculated among ourselves when Ellis wasn't around. Some thought the rooms were meant to store illegal goods. Others whispered about government experiments or underground bunkers for the elite. But the most persistent theory, and the one that haunted me the most, was that the rooms were for people. Prison cells, someone called them. Ellis overheard that once and shut down the conversation with a glare that could have frozen fire. The work was grueling. The walls of the tunnel were thick, reinforced with old concrete and steel that dulled our tools and resisted every blow. Hours turned into days and days into weeks as we chipped away at the walls inch by inch. The air grew heavier with each passing day, thick with dust and the faint metallic tang of something I couldn't identify. By the time the rooms were done, my hands were calloused, my lungs burned, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had done something terribly wrong. Then Diddy arrived. I don't know his real name, and I doubt anyone else does either. He was introduced to us simply as Diddy, a wiry man with a perpetual smirk and a voice as smooth as silk. He exuded a strange charisma, the kind that made you want to trust him even as every instinct screamed not to. He didn't look like someone in charge, more like a hustler who had lucked into the role. But the way he carried himself left no doubt that he was the one calling the shots now. Diddy inspected the rooms we had dug, running his hands along the rough walls and nodding approvingly. "Perfect," he said, his voice echoing eerily in the tunnel. "You boys did good work. That should have been the end of it. We should have handed over the keys, so to speak, and walked away. But Diddy had other plans. He needed someone to stay behind, he said, to keep an eye on things and ensure the rooms remained secure. Ellis volunteered me before I could protest. I don't know if he did it out of spite or simply because I was the youngest and least likely to argue, but either way, I was stuck. It started with the noises. At first I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the acoustics or the result of spending too much time alone in that oppressive place. But soon, the sounds grew impossible to ignore. Footsteps echoed through the tunnel when I knew no one else was there. Whispers drifted from the rooms, soft and indistinct, like the murmur of a conversation just out of earshot. Once I heard what I could only describe as a sob, low and guttural, that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I reported the noises to Diddy when he came by for his weekly check-ins, expecting him to dismiss my concerns. Instead, his smirk deepened, and his eyes glinted with a strange amusement. "You're just hearing the echoes of what this place used to be," he said cryptically. "Don't let it get to you. The mind plays tricks down here." His words did nothing to ease my unease. If anything, they made things worse. The way he said it with that casual confidence almost made me believe he knew exactly what was causing the sounds and was simply choosing not to tell me. And so, I stayed with no clear answers, my nights growing heavier with dread. One night, as I lay on my cot with my flashlight flickering overhead, I heard a sound that froze me in place. It was a scraping noise, rhythmic and deliberate, as if something was being dragged along the floor deep within the tunnel. Heart pounding, I grabbed my flashlight and followed the sound, the beam of light trembling with every step I took. It led me to one of the rooms we had dug, the last one on the farthest end. The door, which I had always kept bolted shut, was slightly ajar. I don't remember making the decision to open it. My body moved on its own, a mix of fear and morbid curiosity propelling me forward. The room was empty, of course, just as it had been the day we finished it, but the air inside was different, colder and heavier than the rest of the tunnel. I stepped inside, my breath visible in the sudden chill, and scanned the walls with my flashlight. That's when I saw the marks. They were faint but unmistakable. Scratches etched into the concrete, as if someone had clawed at the walls with their bare hands. I traced the marks with my fingers, the rough grooves sending shivers up my spine. There was no logical explanation for them. No one had been down here but me, and I certainly hadn't made them. Yet there they were, a silent testament to something, or someone, that had been there before. From that night on, the noises escalated. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, until I could almost make out words. The footsteps became more frequent, echoing through the tunnel even when I stood still, holding my breath, and the sobs, God, the sobs, turned into full-blown wails, desperate and guttural, like the cries of someone trapped in eternal torment. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt as if the walls were closing in, the darkness pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. I started keeping a journal, hoping that writing down my experiences might help me make sense of them. But the more I wrote, the less things made sense. My entries grew disjointed, rambling, filled with phrases that didn't seem like my own. Some nights I'd wake up to find new entries scrawled in my handwriting, describing things I didn't remember experiencing. Visions of figures standing at the edge of the tunnel, their faces obscured, or dreams of being buried alive in the walls we had dug. The worst part was the smell. It began faint, barely noticeable, but grew stronger with each passing day. It was a sickly sweet odor, like rotting flesh mixed with damp earth. No matter how much I scrubbed the walls or aired out the tunnel, it lingered, clinging to my clothes and skin until I couldn't escape it. I started to dread going above ground, afraid that the smell would follow me and expose the truth of what was happening down there. By the time Diddy returned for his next check-in, I was a wreck. My hands shook as I tried to explain what had been happening, my voice breaking with the weight of weeks of fear and sleeplessness. He listened in silence, his expression unreadable, and when I finished, he simply nodded. "It's starting," he said, as if that explained everything. "What's starting?" I demanded, my frustration boiling over. "What the hell is going on down here?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he lit a cigarette and leaned against the wall, exhaling a plume of smoke that seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. "You ever hear of a threshold?" he asked finally, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "A place where the boundaries between worlds are thinner than they should be?" I stared at him, not sure if he was being serious or just trying to mess with me. "What are you talking about?" "This tunnel," he said, gesturing around us, "is one of those places. And those rooms you helped dig? They're more than just spaces in the wall. They're invitations." "Invitations to what?" "To them." I wanted to laugh, to call him crazy and walk away. But the look in his eyes stopped me. It wasn't the look of someone spinning a story for fun. It was the look of someone who had seen too much and knew better than to try and explain it to someone who hadn't. "What do you mean, them?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You'll see," he said, crushing his cigarette underfoot. "Or maybe you won't. Either way, you're part of this now. There's no walking away." He left after that, leaving me alone with more questions than answers and a growing sense of dread. The noises continued, louder and more insistent, and the air in the tunnel grew heavier, as if the space itself were alive and suffocating me. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, figures that disappeared the moment I turned to face them. Once I saw a hand, pale and skeletal, reaching out from one of the rooms. By the time I summoned the courage to approach, it was gone. The journal entries became more disturbing, filled with images of violence and despair that I couldn't remember writing. One entry, written in a shaky, unfamiliar hand, simply said, "They're coming." I tried to leave once. I packed my things and made my way to the tunnel's entrance, determined to never set foot in that cursed place again. But as I reached the ladder that led to the surface, a force stopped me. A pressure in my chest that made it impossible to breathe, as if the tunnel itself were refusing to let me go. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, and only when I turned back did the pressure ease. It was then that I realized Diddy had been right. There was no walking away. The days and nights blurred together after that, each one worse than the last. The whispers turned into voices, distinct and mocking, calling my name and laughing when I screamed at them to stop. The figures in the shadows grew bolder, lingering just long enough for me to see their hollow eyes and twisted smiles. And the smell, The godforsaken smell became so overwhelming that I could taste it, a rancid bitterness that clung to my tongue. I stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped caring about anything but surviving another night. My body wasted away, my mind unraveling like a frayed rope, and still, the tunnel held me captive. I thought about ending it, about throwing myself into one of the rooms and letting whatever was in there take me. But even in my darkest moments, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Something about those rooms terrified me more than death itself. And then, one night, it all came to a head. I was sitting on my cot, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline, when the noises reached a fever pitch. The walls shook with the force of something pounding against them, and the air was filled with a cacophony of screams, whispers, and guttural growls. The smell was so overpowering that I gagged, my stomach heaving even though I hadn't eaten in days. The door to the last room, the one with the scratches, swung open on its own. I don't know what compelled me to move, but I found myself standing in front of the open door, staring into the pitch-black void beyond. The air inside was colder than ever, so cold that my breath froze in the air, and then, from the darkness, something stepped out. It wasn't human. I don't have the words to describe it, not fully. It was tall and skeletal, its skin stretched tight over its bones, with eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. Its mouth was filled with too many teeth, jagged and sharp, and its hands ended in claws that clicked against the floor as it moved. It looked at me, and in that moment, I felt my mind shatter. I don't remember what happened after that. When I woke up, I was back on my cot, the tunnel silent and still. The door to the room was closed, the scratches on the walls gone, but the smell remained, a constant reminder of what I had seen. Diddy never came back, and I never left. I couldn't. The tunnel had claimed me, just as it had claimed countless others before me. The rooms we dug weren't just spaces in the wall, they were doors, and once they were opened, there was no closing them. Now, I sit here in the dark, listening to the whispers and waiting for the day they finally take me. And though I hate Diddy for what he did, for dragging me into this nightmare, I can't help but envy him. At least he got to leave. The days after my encounter with the creature were a haze of disjointed reality. Time had lost all meaning in the tunnel. What little remained of my sense of self began to unravel, each fragment slipping through my fingers like grains of sand. The faint sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance became the only rhythm I could hold on to. Everything else, the scratching, the whispers, the shadows that lingered just out of reach, blended into a symphony of dread. I couldn't leave. Not because I was physically restrained, but because the idea of stepping into the world above felt as impossible as sprouting wings and flying. I wasn't the same person who had descended into the tunnel to dig those rooms for Diddy. That version of me had been left behind, buried within the concrete walls alongside whatever remnants of hope I once possessed. The tunnel wasn't just a place now. It was a living thing, a parasite that had fused itself to my soul. Leaving it felt akin to leaving my own body behind. I began talking to the tunnel. It started as muttered curses under my breath, born out of frustration and despair. But soon the conversations grew. I addressed the shadows, asking them who they were and why they tormented me. I whispered to the walls, begging them to tell me their secrets. I knew I was going mad, but in that abyss, madness felt like the only companion I had left. Sometimes the whispers seemed to respond, though never in ways I could comprehend. I would ask a question, why me? And the tunnel would groan, its vibrations reverberating through my chest. Other times, the shadows would flicker in patterns that almost felt like language, shapes forming and dissolving too quickly for my eyes to fully register. Once I thought I heard a single word amidst the cacophony, stay. It wasn't a command, it was a plea. The rooms themselves became an obsession. I began documenting each one in detail, cataloging their dimensions and examining their walls for signs of wear or change. The marks from before had vanished, but new ones appeared. Tiny symbols etched into the concrete, symbols that I couldn't decipher but felt an instinctive fear of. They weren't human, that much was certain. Their angular shapes and spiraling patterns seemed to defy logic, as though they were meant to be read in ways that my brain wasn't equipped to process. I started seeing things in those rooms, fleeting glimpses of movement, shapes shifting in the corners of my vision. At first, I thought it was a trick of the dim light or my own exhaustion. But the longer I stared, the clearer the shapes became. They weren't human. They weren't even alive. Not in any sense I understood. They were forms of pure absence, holes in reality that seemed to drink in the air around them. Once I worked up the courage to step into one of the rooms again. It was the second room we dug, a small, featureless space that I had thought unremarkable until that moment. As I crossed the threshold, the air inside the room changed. It grew thick and heavy, pressing against my skin like an invisible tide. I felt as though I were being watched, not by eyes but by the room itself, as though the walls were conscious and aware of my intrusion. The longer I stood there, the more the room seemed to change. The walls began to ripple, subtle waves coursing through the concrete as if it were liquid. The symbols carved into the surface glowed faintly, pulsing in time with a rhythm I couldn't hear but could feel deep in my chest. It wasn't until I felt something brush against my leg, something cold and slimy, that I bolted out of the room, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The rooms weren't just invitations, as Diddy had said. They were portals, bridges to somewhere, or something else. And whatever lay on the other side was beginning to seep through. My dreams turned darker after that. I stopped dreaming of mundane things like home or family. Instead, my nights were filled with visions of vast, incomprehensible landscapes. I saw cities built of black stone, their spires piercing a sky that churned with colors I had no name for. I walked through endless corridors lined with doors that opened into empty voids, each one colder and darker than the last. And always in the distance I could hear them, the voices calling to me, urging me to come closer. One night, I woke up to find that I wasn't alone. A figure stood at the edge of the light cast by my flashlight, its form indistinct and shrouded in shadow. It didn't move or speak, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. I froze, my body paralyzed with fear, and watched as it slowly raised a hand to point toward one of the rooms. Then, as silently as it had appeared, it was gone. I didn't go to the room it had indicated. I couldn't. Whatever was in there, I wasn't ready to face it. But I knew it was only a matter of time before the choice was taken from me. The tunnel began to shift. I don't know how else to describe it. Walls that had once been solid and unchanging seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as though alive. The floor grew uneven, the concrete buckling and cracking under my feet. Lights flickered erratically, plunging me into darkness for agonizingly long stretches. And the whispers, oh, the whispers, they no longer stayed confined to the rooms. They followed me, circling around my head like a swarm of invisible insects. I tried to reach out to Diddy again, using the old radio he'd left behind during one of his visits. To my surprise, he answered. His voice crackled through the static, sounding distant and strained. "You're still there?" he asked, as though he hadn't expected me to survive this long. "Diddy, you need to tell me what's happening," I said, my voice trembling. "What did you make us do? What are these rooms?" There was a long pause before he replied. "I told you, they're invitations, but I didn't tell you who or what they're inviting." "Then tell me now." "I can't," he said. "You wouldn't understand. Try me." Another pause, longer this time. "The things on the other side, they're not meant for this world. They don't belong here, and they don't belong there either. They exist in between, waiting for a way in. Those rooms, they're keys, and you," his voice faltered, "you're the one who opened the door." The radio went dead before I could respond. I wanted to hate him, to blame him for everything, but deep down I knew he was right. I had been the one to dig those rooms, to break the seals that had kept whatever lay beyond at bay. Whether I had known it or not, I had played my part in unleashing them. The tunnel claimed more of me every day. My body grew weaker, my mind more fragmented. I stopped writing in the journal, unable to trust the words that appeared on its pages. I began to hear my own voice among the whispers, taunting me with memories of who I had once been. And always, the rooms loomed, silent and waiting, their dark doorways beckoning me to step inside. One night, I finally gave in. I don't know what compelled me to do it. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps the tunnel itself had worn me down to the point where resistance was impossible. I walked to the last room, the one that had first opened itself to me, and stood at the threshold, staring into the darkness. This time I didn't hesitate. I stepped inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the world shifted. The air grew impossibly heavy, pressing down on me from all sides, and the walls dissolved into a swirling void. I felt as though I were falling, though my feet never left the ground. Shapes moved in the darkness around me, vast and incomprehensible, their forms defying logic and reason. They were ancient, older than the stars, and they were hungry. They spoke to me, not in words but in feelings, emotions that hit me like waves of fire and ice. They showed me visions of their world, a place of endless darkness and suffering, where time and space twisted into knots. They showed me what they wanted, to escape, to break free from their prison and spill into our world like a flood. And then they made me an offer. They didn't speak it aloud, but I understood it all the same. They wanted a vessel, a way to anchor themselves to this reality. In return, they promised to spare me, to grant me power and knowledge beyond anything I could imagine. All I had to do was say yes. I said no. The void erupted in fury, the shapes writhing and screaming in a cacophony of rage. I felt their wrath clawing at me, tearing at the edges of my mind, but somehow, I held on. I don't know how I escaped that place, only that I woke up on the floor of the tunnel, my body bruised and my mind scarred. The rooms were gone. The tunnel was silent. I should have felt relief, but all I felt was emptiness. I had survived, but at what cost? The things I had seen, the knowledge I now carried, it would never leave me. I was a broken man, haunted by the echoes of a world that should never have touched ours. I began marking the days on the walls near my cot, scratching tallies with a piece of rusted metal I'd found in the debris. I don't know why I do it. Time has no real meaning here anymore. The tunnel doesn't obey the laws of the surface world. I've noticed strange shifts, stretches of hours that seem to vanish in an instant, or moments that stretch endlessly, leaving me suspended in a liminal space where minutes feel like years. The tally marks aren't a record of time anymore. They're a record of my endurance. At night, I dream of the void. Not of the tunnel or the rooms, but of the place I glimpsed when I stepped into that final threshold. I dream of the shapes, those impossibly vast, writhing forms that defied every law of nature. I dream of their eyes, or what I think were their eyes, burning with an ancient malice, their desire to consume, to spread, to become. Their voices echo in my head long after I wake, not as words but as sensations. Cold fire, endless weight, a hunger that feels like the pulling of a black hole. The physical effects of my time here are undeniable. My body is wasting away. My ribs press against my skin like jagged peaks, and my muscles have shriveled into something unrecognizable. My hair has thinned, my nails cracked and brittle. Even my eyes feel foreign in my skull, as if they belong to someone or something else. I am a husk of the man who once descended into this place, and I doubt I would recognize myself if I ever found the courage to look into a mirror. Occasionally I hear sounds from above, the faint rumble of a subway train or the distant thud of footsteps on pavement. They feel unreal, like echoes from a world I no longer belong to. Once I thought I heard voices, real human voices, calling down into the tunnel. They sounded urgent, searching. I should have answered, but I couldn't. The words wouldn't form in my throat. Instead, I watched as their light, brighter and warmer than anything I'd seen in months, flickered and disappeared. They never returned. I wonder if they were real, or if the tunnel was playing tricks on me again. It's hard to distinguish what is real and what isn't anymore. The lines between reality and illusion have blurred so thoroughly that even my own memories feel suspect. Did I truly dig those rooms? Did Diddy even exist? Or was he another fabrication of the tunnel's twisted will? These questions swirl in my mind and no answers come, only silence. Sometimes, I think about surrendering to the tunnel, to let whatever it wants happen. Perhaps if I stop fighting, it will finally show me its full truth. The purpose behind the rooms, the entities in the void, the reason I was chosen to endure this torment. Other times, I think about running, of climbing the ladder and forcing my body into the sunlight, even if it kills me. But every time I imagine escape, I feel that weight again, that suffocating pressure that holds me here. The tunnel won't let me leave, not until it's done with me. I've begun speaking to the absence again, this time not as a plea, but as a demand. What do you want from me? I shout into the endless corridor, my voice echoing back like a hollow mockery. Why won't you let me go? Of course, there's no response, only the lingering stillness that feels more alive than any answer could. And yet, in the silence, there is something else, a presence. It isn't malevolent, not like the things I saw in the void, but neither is it comforting. It feels old, older than the city above, older than humanity itself. It's the kind of presence that exists in the roots of mountains and the deepest parts of the ocean, something that has always been and always will be. It doesn't speak to me, but I feel its intent. It's watching, waiting, testing me. I don't know how long I've been here now. The tallies on the wall blur together, indistinct marks in the dim light. My memories of life before this place have grown faint, like a dream I woke from long ago. The faces of friends and family are distant, their voices drowned out by the whispers that now fill my every waking moment. And still, I endure. But I do. The tunnel hasn't beaten me yet, though it has tried. Perhaps that is my role here. Not to escape, not to understand, but simply to endure. To outlast the darkness. To prove in some small way that even in a place designed to break me, I can survive. For now, that is enough. The longer I stay, the more the tunnel reveals its true nature, as though it senses my resolve and seeks to wear it down by degrees. The air no longer feels inert. It hums, faintly at first, like the residual vibrations of an ancient machine restarting after eons of disuse. The walls seem alive now, pulsing with faint movements I can barely catch unless I stare too long. At times, I think I hear a heartbeat, not my own, but something deeper, slower, as if the tunnel itself were alive and breathing. The presence I felt before has grown stronger, more defined. It's not just watching anymore, it's probing, pressing against my mind with questions I can't articulate but feel nonetheless. It's as though the tunnel is trying to understand me, dissect me piece by piece, not out of malice but curiosity. It wants to know why I'm still here, why I haven't succumbed like the others, whoever they were. I catch flashes of them sometimes in my dreams, shadowy figures whose faces are blank, but whose anguish is unmistakable. They stand in the rooms I helped dig, their forms blurred, their arms outstretched as though reaching for something I can't see. The whispers have changed too. They're no longer aimless or scattered, but organized, their tones rising and falling in a pattern that feels almost like language. I've begun to decipher pieces of it, though I don't know how. Words and phrases drift into my mind unbidden, fragments of meaning that chill me to the core. Threshold, conduit, awakening. Sometimes I hear my own name spoken in the chorus, twisted and warped but unmistakable. I've started to notice things that weren't here before. Strange growths cling to the walls in certain places, dark and glistening like some kind of fungus but pulsating faintly, as if alive. The substance oozes a faint phosphorescent light, just enough to illuminate the immediate area in an eerie glow. I avoid touching it, but the smell is inescapable, sharp and chemical, with a metallic undertone that makes my head spin. The patches of growth are spreading, creeping further along the walls with each passing day, as though the tunnel itself is transforming, reshaping to accommodate whatever forces I've unleashed. One night, I woke to find the growths had reached my cot. They pulsed faintly in the darkness, tendrils curling and uncurling as if seeking something. I shoved the cot away, heart pounding, and retreated to the other end of the tunnel. For hours I watched from a distance as the tendrils writhed and stretched, only to finally recede as if sated. The thought struck me that the tunnel, or whatever was controlling it, had been testing me again, seeing how far it could push before I broke. The loneliness is the hardest part. I've begun speaking aloud to myself, just to hear a human voice, even if it's my own. But the tunnel twists even that small comfort. Sometimes as I speak, I hear an echo that doesn't quite match my words, a fraction of a second too slow or too fast, as though something else is imitating me. The voice is familiar, mine, but not mine, and it makes my skin crawl every time I hear it. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on the tunnel rooms for Diddy in 2012? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.